Hello dear students, from this session we will be learning Unit 2 Solutions. I know in all the campuses this chapter was started before the lockdown. To some extent they would have finished it. You must have understood the introduction of solutions already, that solutions are homogeneous mixture of two or more substances. And if there are only two components in the solution, then you call it a binary solution, in which the minor component is called solute, major component is called solvent. All these things you know from school itself. Now in this chapter, in your second year, there are four concepts. One is the expressing concentration of solutions, that is concentration terms, which include mass percent, volume percent, mass volume percent, molarity, normality, molality, mole fraction, parts per million. Second one is the concept of solubility, that is how well a given solute will be dissolved in a given solvent. And by the way, this chapter deals only with liquid based solutions, that is where liquid is the solvent. So in a given liquid solvent, whether it is a solid solute or liquid solute or gaseous solute, how well it dissolves, why does it dissolve, and what factors influence the dissolution. This is discussed under the concept of solubility. Then we have got vapor pressure of solutions. See, every liquid exerts vapor pressure or exhibits vapor pressure. The meaning and definition of vapor pressure you must have learned in your first year states of matter chapter when you are learning liquid state after finishing gaseous state. However, I will be introducing that here also. So every liquid has vapor pressure. Now I add some solute into this liquid and prepare a solution, then what happens to its vapor pressure? That is discussed under the concept of vapor pressure of solutions. Then lastly, dilute solutions exhibit a set of properties, a set of unique properties called colligative properties. Introduction, details of those colligative properties will be your last topic in this chapter. Now, in these video lessons during this lockdown, I am skipping the first topic and straight away starting off my discussion with session 2, that is concept of solubility, for two reasons. One is that they must have done it to you before lockdown, and two is that this was already part of your first year's some basic concepts of chemistry, that is unit 1. That's why I am directly going to concept of solubility. However, at the end of the chapter, when we solve objective exercise, we will solve questions based on concentration terms also, so that it gets revised again for you in these video lessons also. Okay? So we will start off with the concept of solubility, that is mentioned as session 2 in your EPL. Get ready with your EPL books and ready to listen to the lesson. Okay? Now if you notice, there will be a review exercise before you switch to a concept of solubility, before you start concept of solubility. That review exercise is to quickly brush the fundamental knowledge required for understanding whatever is going to come next in this topic called concept of solubility. So, before even doing that review exercise, I'll quickly brush up your fundamentals, which are from your school knowledge as well as the knowledge of your first PU syllabus. Okay, that is constituent particles of matter and forces holding them. Means, if you take any form of matter, what kind of microscopic particles might be present in it? All of you are aware from your school that every macroscopic substance is a collection of very large number of very tiny particles, microscopic particles. Now, various substances, macroscopic substances, are made up of what kind of microscopic particles? Number one. And number two, in those substances, how those particles are held against each other. If we understand that, then we will be able to understand when these substances are mixed up with each other, how one particle can attract the other in the mixture, because solutions are mixtures. Got it? Now, all the macroscopic substances, pure substances on this earth, can be classified into 6 types according to me. They are: number 1, metals; number 2, metalloids; number 3, noble gases; number 4, non-metals; number 5, covalent compounds; and number 6, ionic compounds. Covalent compounds are otherwise called molecular compounds. I'll tell you why. However, these 4 together are named as elements, you know very well. And these 2 together are named as compounds, you know very well. Now, based on their nature, physical as well as chemical nature, elements will be classified into metals, metalloids, noble gases and non-metals, you know that. And based on the nature of forces holding the molecules, or based on the bonds upon which the substance is formed, the compounds are of 2 types: covalent compounds and ionic compounds. Now, if you think of what kind of constituent particles hold them, metal. If I ask you examples of metals, you might mention sodium, you might mention magnesium, you might mention copper, you might mention zinc, you might mention gold, platinum, etc. Now, to represent any metal, what are we writing? We are writing symbols. Symbols are representation of one atom of an element. That's why metals are made up of atoms. Right? Then, if I ask you to represent any metalloids, you will mention them as arsenic, germanium, antimony, tellurium, polonium, etc. Right? Now, how are we mentioning the metalloids? How are we representing the metalloids? Even they are represented by symbols, and symbols are representation of one atom of an element. So, the constituent particles of metalloids also are atoms. That means, if you look through microscope into this substance, what you see, the smallest particle is atom. Smallest independent particle is atom. Similarly, helium, neon, argon, krypton, xenon, radon. Again, when I ask you to represent noble gases, how are you representing? Using symbols, and symbols represent one atom of an element. That means noble gases are also made up of atoms. So conclusion, among the elements, metals, metalloids, noble gases are made up of atoms. Whereas non-metals, if I ask you to represent, you will represent them as hydrogen, nitrogen, oxygen, fluorine, chlorine, bromine, sulfur, phosphorus, etc. Now, how are you representing the elements called non-metals? You are representing them using molecules. Similarly, if I ask you to write covalent compounds, you will write HCl, carbon dioxide, hydrogen sulfide, okay, ammonia, etc. you will write. Okay. If I ask you to represent ionic compounds, you will write sodium chloride, copper sulfate, magnesium oxide, etc. You know the list. Now, all these 3 are appearing like molecules only. Yes or no? If there is a single atom, you call it atom. If more than one atoms are combined, you call them molecules, and all of them are appearing like molecules. Then what is the difference between this set of molecules and this sets of molecules? You know, these molecules are made up of atoms of same element. Such molecules are called homoatomic molecules. Such molecules are called homoatomic molecules, whereas the molecules which are made up of different kinds of atoms are called heteroatomic molecules. Now the question is, covalent compounds also appear to have heteroatomic molecules. Ionic compounds also appear to have heteroatomic molecules. But you know very well, let me remind you that these are not molecules. These actually exist as ions. Sodium cation, chloride anion. Copper cation, sulfate anion. Magnesium cation, oxide anion, etc. So, the constituent particles in ionic compounds are not molecules, they are actually ions. What is the main difference between a covalent compound and an ionic compound? Let us understand that by taking these two species, HCl and NaCl, hydrogen chloride and sodium chloride. Please understand, hydrogen chloride is made up of covalent molecules, whereas sodium chloride is made up of sodium cation chloride anion. Now, in a sample of hydrogen chloride, I have this HCl molecule, this HCl molecule, this HCl molecule. Now, this hydrogen belongs to this chlorine only, this hydrogen belongs to this chlorine only, this hydrogen belongs to this chlorine only. Means, each of the molecules are independent from each other. Whereas, if you take an ionic compound, in detail you will learn their crystal structures in the first chapter called solid state later. However, please understand, each cation is surrounded by a fixed number of anions. Each anion is surrounded by a fixed number of cations such that any sodium chloride unit is not independent. Any sodium chloride unit is not absolutely independent. Means a sodium is surrounded by 6 chlorides like this, and each chloride is surrounded octahedrally again by 6 sodium cations. Likewise, cation, anion, cation, anion, cation, anion, cation, anion, in 3 dimensions, they are so packed up that you can't say each unit is independent from each other. That's why calling ionic compound units as molecules is absolutely wrong when it comes to practical basis. That's why we use the word formula unit. We use the word formula unit. Means if you take a lattice containing billion cations and billion anions, and the ratio of cations anions is 1:1, that's why I am writing NaCl. So that is one formula unit. So please understand, the ions in an ionic compound are not independent, they are all packed up. So no single individual units can be recognized. Whereas in covalent compounds, each molecule is absolutely independent from each other. Each molecule is absolutely independent from each other, such that in case of ionic compounds, since all of them are together, the physical properties are decided by that electrostatic force called ionic bond that is holding them. Whereas in case of covalent compounds, chemical properties may be decided by how strong the atoms are held with each other, which is called covalent bond. Whereas physical properties, like in what physical state it should exist, whether what boiling point it should have, what melting point it should have, whether it should be soluble in other substance or other given solvent or not, all these things are decided by what holds one molecule from the other. All these things are decided by what holds one molecule from the other, which are called intermolecular forces. So, interparticle forces in ionic compounds are simply interionic attractions, which otherwise called as ionic bond, which is a strong electrostatic force. Whereas between covalent molecules, a variety of attraction forces are possible, and they are commonly called as intermolecular forces. Now, what is the difference between the molecules present in nonmetals and covalent compounds? Nonmetals are made up of homoatomic covalent molecules, whereas covalent compounds are made up of heteroatomic covalent molecules. Conclusion: all the macroscopic substances on this earth can be categorized into 6 categories. Metals, metalloids, noble gases, non-metals, covalent compounds and ionic compounds. Metals, metalloids, noble gases are made up of atoms. Non-metals are made up of homoatomic covalent molecules. Covalent compounds are made up of heteroatomic covalent molecules. And ionic compounds are made up of ions. And the difference from covalent compounds, ionic compounds is so simple that if all the constituent atoms of the substance are non-metals, then it is a covalent compound. If one is metal, the other is non-metal, then it is an ionic compound. So, in its constitution, if there are metallic atoms, it is an ionic compound. Then you can clearly understand these species are not neutral atoms, they are charged particles called ions. Last important point I told you was, in ionic compounds, all the ions are packed up in such a way that each individual particle you can recognize is ion and none of them are absolutely independent. So you can't call them molecules, you can only call them formula units. And its physical properties are decided by the electrostatic force of attraction called ionic bond. Whereas in covalent molecules, in each molecule, covalent bond holds the atoms that will decide the chemical properties of the substance, whereas the physical properties of the substance are decided by what holds one molecule from the other, called as intermolecular forces, otherwise called van der Waals forces, which we are going to discuss next. Now, as I was just telling you, preparing solutions is a physical phenomenon. There is no chemical reactions involved there. So, that's why the very chapter is under physical chemistry. You must be understanding that. Now, dissolution is a physical phenomenon and all the physical properties including solubility are decided by interparticle attractions. What holds one particle from the other. Now, I am going to list out all the possible interparticle forces in substances in the decreasing order of their strength, starting from ion-ion forces, which will be present in ionic compounds and you call it ionic bond otherwise. Second one is ion dipole forces. When do these arise? We will be discussing in detail about them under concept of solubility, which comes next. However, let me give you a quick idea. When an ion is dissolved into a polar solvent, when solvent is already polar, that means it has two ends, positive end and negative end, then the molecules of solvent are called dipoles. Now, opposite end of dipole attracts the given ion, means if it is cation, negative end of dipole will be attracted to cation. If it is anion, positive end of dipole will be attracted to anion. Such force between ions and the dipole molecules of the solvent like water are called ion dipole forces. Then comes intermolecular hydrogen bonds. You must have studied them in 2 chapters last year, that is hydrogen chapter as well as chemical bonding chapter, where whenever there is attraction between a more electronegative atom and an electropositive hydrogen of 2 different molecules, then you call it intermolecular hydrogen bond. Even that holds the particles sometimes. And then number 4, dipole-dipole forces, which is one of the forms of van der Waals forces and is named as Keesum forces based on the scientist who explained them. Number 5, dipole-induced dipole forces named as Debye forces based on the scientist who named them. Number 6, induced dipole forces, most popularly named as London forces. Okay, now these 3 are together called as van der Waals forces, you know that. Now let us quickly understand in what kind of substances. I have already told you this is in the decreasing order of their strength. Which are the strongest interparticle forces? ion-ion interactions. Which are the weakest interparticle forces? London forces. Now, between what kind of particles, in what kind of substances these forces exist? Let us understand. Ion-ion forces exist in ionic compounds. There is not much discussion about it. They can exist whether in the solutions or in their solid state. In their solid state, they are very strongly attracted. In their solution, being separated by the solvent molecules, they may not be strongly attracted, but still those ion interactions exist. Remember when I was teaching you electrochemistry, I told you in strong electrolytes at higher concentrations, because of ion-ion interactions only, the conductance will be lower. Then, ion dipole forces exist in solutions of ionic compounds in polar solvents. Solutions of, I know I have to better my handwriting, don't worry, I'll write better from now. Solutions of ionic compounds in polar solvents, when you prepare, the ions will be surrounded by the dipole molecules of the polar solvent there, so ion dipole forces exist. So, ion dipole forces are possible only in mixtures, please understand. Whereas ion-ion forces can be possible in pure compounds also. Intermolecular hydrogen bonds. Before going to intermolecular hydrogen bonds, I'll first explain dipole-dipole forces. See, dipole-dipole forces are Keesom forces exist between polar molecules. Say HCl. In a sample of HCl, what holds the two HCl molecules from each other? HCl is a dipole, so negative end called chlorine attracts the positive end called hydrogen. That's why they are attracting each other. So dipole-dipole forces exist in polar covalent substances. It could be either in pure substance or when you mix each other. You understand? See, pure substance, for example, I take hydrogen chloride, nothing else. In hydrogen chloride, all the HCl molecules are held from each other due to dipole-dipole forces only. So, that's why any pure polar covalent substance, or when two polar covalent substances are mixed with each other, one will be attracting the other only due to dipole-dipole forces. Clear? Please follow it because these things are very important in this chapter. Now, intermolecular hydrogen bond is an extreme case of dipole-dipole force. What kind of extreme case is it? Please understand. It should satisfy two conditions. One is there must be hydrogen in the molecule. Second one is it must be attached to either fluorine or oxygen or nitrogen. Make it simple. So, there is polarity, and polarity is due to any difference in electronegativity between any other atoms, then it is dipole-dipole forces. There is polarity, and the polarity is due to difference in electronegativity between hydrogen and fluorine, or hydrogen and oxygen, or hydrogen and nitrogen, then there is intermolecular hydrogen bonding. So please understand, intermolecular hydrogen bonding is an extreme case of dipole-dipole forces. I know you have learnt intermolecular hydrogen bonding already, and you will get more examples when we go forward. But I want you to understand this difference very clearly. So, the substances in which there is polarity due to any other electronegative atom than fluorine or oxygen or nitrogen, because these are the three most electronegative atoms. If it is existing due to atoms other than these, then it is dipole-dipole forces. If it is existing due to these, then it is intermolecular hydrogen bonds. Is that clear? Now, where do dipole-induced dipole forces exist? Again, ion-ion forces can be present in pure substances. Intermolecular hydrogen bonds as well as dipole-dipole forces can be present in pure substances or between two different substances when they are mixed also, depending upon the criteria which I mentioned. Then dipole-induced dipole forces, otherwise called Debye forces, are possible only when two substances are mixed, one polar and one non-polar substance. So say for example, I am mixing hydrogen gas and hydrogen chloride gas. Now, evidence dictates that these particles attract each other. What is the evidence? Can't I liquefy a mixture of hydrogen and hydrogen chloride gases? I can absolutely liquefy them. Now, hydrogen contains bonds between two atoms which are identical from each other. So, electronegativity difference is 0. Hence, it is absolutely a non-polar molecule. Hydrogen chloride contains a bond between two differently electronegative atoms. So, it is absolutely a polar molecule. Now, when I am mixing hydrogen gas and hydrogen chloride gas and cooling them or compressing them, they will liquefy together. So, them liquefying together clearly indicates that they are attracting each other. Now, Debye explained how they attract each other means, Debye explained that the positively end of this dipole pulls the electrons of this non-polar molecules towards one side, such that this gets distorted and one side it becomes negatively charged, other side it becomes positively charged. That means this fellow is inducing the dipole into this fellow and started attracting. That's why they are called dipole induced dipole forces. So possible only when you mix one polar substance with one non-polar substance. Getting my point? Since we are discussing mixtures only in solutions, very important. Lastly, induced dipole forces. Hydrogen gas can be liquefied. Then how are two hydrogen molecules being attracted from each other when both of them are absolutely non-polar? Chlorine gas can be liquefied. Then how are one chlorine molecule attracting the other? How is one chlorine molecule attracting the other chlorine molecule when they are absolutely non-polar? Methane gas can be liquefied. And you know the net dipole moment of methane is 0. That means methane is a non-polar molecule. Then how is one methane molecule attracting the other methane molecule if they are absolutely non-polar? There are no charges. There is no electrostatic force to account for. Here you check, any of these forces is indirectly attracted due to electrostatic force only. But here there is no electrostatic force as such. Then how are they attracting each other? Practical evidence suggests that they are being liquefied, so they are being attracted to each other. Then how are they being attracted to each other? London, a scientist, explained saying that during their movement, a transient dipole, a temporary dipole is created. That temporary dipole makes them a dipole. How temporary dipole is created? Due to the motion, part of electron density comes one side. When the electron density comes one side, that side becomes negatively charged, so the other side automatically becomes positively charged. Due to that, a dipole is created. The dipole which is inducing in itself is called transient dipole. You call it transient dipole. The one which induces self-induced dipole called transient dipole induces the dipole in other. That's how what you call it, induced dipole. So these forces, which are otherwise called London forces, are present between non-polar substances. Means in a pure substance like hydrogen, all the molecules are attracting each other by London forces. In a pure substance called chlorine, all the molecules are attracting each other by London force. Whereas if I mix two gases, hydrogen and chlorine, hydrogen molecules are attracted to chlorine or chlorine are attracted to hydrogen due to London forces. Likewise, London forces could be mixture or pure substance. Dipole induced dipole will be purely in mixture. Only in mixtures, polar and non-polar substances are mixed with each other. Dipole forces, intermolecular hydrogen bonds can be possible both in mixtures and pure substances. Ion dipole forces only possible in mixtures when an ionic compound is dissolved in a polar solvent, and ion-ion forces are possible in pure substances. These are the various possible types of interparticle forces. Among them, this is strongest and London forces are the weakest. This knowledge throughout the rest of the chapter until I finish the concept of vapor pressure of solutions, this knowledge is very much required. Now, with this knowledge, let us answer question number 2 and 3 of your review exercise 2.2. Then we can go to question number 1, for which I need to quickly revise Le Chatelier principle. Okay, so review exercise 2.2. Now in the second question of your review exercise 2.2, I'll go to first question by the way. In the second question of review exercise 2.2, a set of 14 substances were given. I've just numbered them so that it will be convenient for me to mark them later. Now he has asked you two questions from this. One is, classify these substances into ionic substances and covalent substances. Second one is, whether would they dissociate in water, or would they ionize in water, or would they form intermolecular hydrogen bonds with water. This is very important for us because water is the universal polar solvent and most of the solutions we discuss would be aqueous solutions. So that's why this understanding is very, very important. It's a good question from your review exercise. First, let me answer this. Then I'll give you background to answer this so that you can pause this video, answer yourself and come back and get the answers. Now, even this, you know very well. If it is made up of metal as well as non-metal, it must be an ionic compound. It is made up of only non-metal atoms, then it must be a covalent compound. So pause the video, mark your answers, then I'll start the video and look at the answer. Hope you have done that. I'm going to it. Okay, now glucose, you know very well. Ionic, of course, they have called it molecular, of course, in your book. Glucose, ionic or molecular? Glucose is, of course, molecular. Then hydrogen chloride, ionic or molecular? Absolutely molecular, because it contains covalent bonds. Sodium sulfate, sodium is a metal, sulfur and oxygen are non-metals, and sodium cation, sulfate anion are the constituent particles. That's why sodium sulfate is an ionic compound. Acetic acid, absolutely molecular, because all the organic compounds are covalent. Acetic acid is an organic acid. Potassium hydroxide, there is a metal. When there is a metal, it must be an ionic compound. Potassium cation, hydroxyl anion. So it is an ionic compound. Number 6, copper sulfate. Metal copper is there. It must come here only. Copper cation, sulfate anion. Ammonia, nitrogen and hydrogen both are non-metals. So ammonia must be a covalent compound or a molecular substance. So 7 I should put here. Moving on to 8. There is a metal. So obviously I should put here. Sorry. Sodium cyanide. Sodium cation, cyanide anion. Carbon, hydrogen, oxygen. All the three are non-metals, and you know ethanol is an organic compound. All the organic compounds are molecular or covalent. Then lithium chloride. I should put it here. Now you must be surprised. Lithium is a metal. That too comes from most electropositive group called as alkali metals. Chlorine is a non-metal. That too comes from most electronegative group called halogens. Then why am I writing lithium chloride and covalent compounds? They must be molecular ionic compounds, right? Try to recollect the concept of polarization from first year chemical bonding chapter. Whenever the cation is too small and whenever the anion is large, the cation tends to polarize the anion. You know, polarizing power of cation is given by the formula charge divided by radius square. So smaller the radius, more the polarizing power. So it will distort the electron cloud of the anion, pull into it and overlap and form covalent bond instead of ionic bond. That's why it is an exceptional case. NH2 taken twice, CO is nothing but urea, and urea is absolutely a molecular substance. Zinc chloride. Zinc is a metal, chlorine is a non-metal, so it must be an ionic compound. Hydrogen fluoride. Both are non-metals, so it must be a covalent or molecular substance. Oxalic acid, an organic compound, so must be a molecular substance. So 5 ionic compounds we had in this list, rest 9 of them were covalent or molecular substances. So after we got command on recognizing which substance is ionic and which substance is covalent, now from these 14 substances they are asking which one would dissociate in water, which one would ionize in water, and which one would form intermolecular hydrogen bonds with water. Let me give you background of it, how to recognize. Then you pause the video, try to answer and then get back here. Okay, now you see. See, let me take again these two classic examples, sodium chloride and hydrogen chloride. Assume I have dissolved both of them into water. This will also form aqueous sodium cation and aqueous chloride anion. This will also form aqueous hydrogen cation and aqueous chloride anion. So, both sodium chloride and hydrogen chloride, when dissolved in water, do produce ions. But what is the difference in formation of ions in the solution here? The answer is, in sodium chloride, ions are becoming just independent in the solution, whereas in hydrogen chloride, ions are formed in the solution. Means, here already as a solid itself, it was made up of cation and anion. Whereas in hydrogen chloride, though due to difference in electronegativity, we might assign an apparent charge called oxidation state and say this is +1, this is -1. That is an apparent charge assigned by us based on the electronegativity differences, that's all. Practically, is hydrogen carrying any charge in hydrogen chloride? No, it's neutral. Is chlorine carrying any charge in hydrogen chloride? No, it is neutral. Whereas when it is dissolved in water, because chlorine is already more electronegative and electrons are already more displaced towards chlorine, both the bonding electrons shift here. Now when formed, they were formed by donation of 1 electron each. Now both electrons are taken by chlorine, that means chlorine is gaining 1 electron, so became anion. Hydrogen is losing 1 electron, so became cation. So please understand, neutral particles have turned into ions here. In any phenomenon where neutral particles becomes ion is called ionization, because ions are formed here. When ions are formed, you call it ionization. Whereas when the existing ions are simply broken, you call it dissociation. So please understand, covalent compounds undergo ionization in water, whereas ionic compounds undergo dissociation in water. The difference between the two words is that already they are ions, just their attractions are broken to make them independent, then you call it dissociation. Whereas they were neutral particles turned into ions in the solution, then you call it ionization. In covalent molecules, atoms are basically neutral. Because of breaking of bonds, heterolytically, they are transforming into ions, then in covalent molecules, it is called ionization. Whereas in ionic compound, it is called dissociation. Then what about formation of intermolecular hydrogen bonds with water? Simple. Covalent compounds may either ionize in water or they may form intermolecular hydrogen bonds. When do they ionize in water? When they are simply polar covalent substances. Whereas when do they form intermolecular hydrogen bonds with water? When in their composition, hydrogen is attached to one of the most electronegative atoms like either fluorine or oxygen or nitrogen. These are the three most electronegative atoms which force hydrogen to enter into hydrogen bonding. So please understand, from this category, before you try and answer the question, let me conclude. From this category, if you find them ionic compounds, put here. If you find them covalent compounds with no features required for hydrogen bonding, put here. If there are features required for hydrogen bonding, put here. Okay? Try it yourself. Get back. I am giving away the answer now. Glucose is a covalent substance and it cannot produce any ions in water, so it is going to form intermolecular hydrogen bonds with water. HCl is no doubt a covalent substance and it is a polar substance, already I discussed, so it is going to undergo ionization in water. Then sodium sulfate, being an ionic compound, undergoes dissociation in water. Acetic acid is a covalent substance. It ionizes as acetate ion and H+ ion in water. You know that. Now you must be wondering, just now you told whenever hydrogen is attached to oxygen or nitrogen or fluorine, it must be forming intermolecular hydrogen bonds with water, you said, sir. But now you are immediately saying that it undergoes ionization. Of course, being an acid, being a reactive proton here, it will be released as H plus ion. That's why it prefers to ionize in water. Okay. Then comes potassium hydroxide, which is an ionic compound, so you can put it under dissociation. Copper sulfate, another ionic compound, so put it under dissociation. Ammonia, a covalent substance where hydrogen is attached to nitrogen, one of the most electronegative 3 atoms. That's why you put it under intermolecular hydrogen bonds with water. Sodium cyanide, ionic, put it under dissociation. Ethanol, covalent, cannot ionize in water because it is not acidic. Please understand. Whenever the hydrogen of the covalent substance is acidic, it ionizes. When it is a non-acidic hydrogen, it forms intermolecular hydrogen bonds with water. Lithium chloride is a covalent compound, and of course we should call it ionization, not dissociation. Then urea cannot form ions. It is a molecular substance but still soluble in water because it forms intermolecular hydrogen bonds with water. Zinc chloride, ionic compound, so dissociates in water. Hydrogen fluoride, covalent substance, possible for intermolecular hydrogen bonds, but still it is an acid. When there is an acidic hydrogen, it undergoes ionization in water. Same is the case with oxalic acid, contains acidic hydrogen, so undergoes ionization in water. An ionic compound dissociates in water. A covalent compound with polarity and then acidic hydrogen undergoes ionization in water. A covalent compound which cannot ionize in water but contains hydrogen attached to a more electronegative atom like hydrogen or oxygen or nitrogen forms intermolecular hydrogen bonds with water. That is your question number 2 of review exercise 2.2. In the second question, which is from your NCERT textbook, a set of 5 pairs of substances are given and he is asking you what kind of interparticle attractions might be present between the pairs of their molecules. Now, the first one is N-hexane and N-octane. You know very well, all the hydrocarbons are non-polar substances. Hexane, C6H14, octane, C8H18. Both are absolutely non-polar. Between non-polar particles, what must be present? Try to recollect or rewind the video and check what I just taught you. So it must be London forces. Because both particles are absolutely non-polar, the only possible forces are London forces. Moving on. Iodine and carbon tetrachloride. See, in iodine molecule, the bonds are I and I. So a homoatomic molecule it is. A bond between two identical atoms. So electronegativities will be equal. The electronegativity difference XA minus XB will be 0. When electronegativity difference is 0, the molecule must be absolutely non-polar. So iodine is a non-polar substance. Understood? Come to carbon tetrachloride. I am sure carbon-chlorine bond is polar, but dipole moment is a vector quantity you have studied last year. So when it is a vector quantity and when the molecule is symmetric, the net dipole, individual dipole moments are called bond moments. The net dipole moment is obtained by adding the bond moments as per vector addition. And because these bonds will be in opposite direction, their bond moments will be in opposite direction, the net dipole moment of this molecule will be 0. Hence, carbon tetrachloride also is non-polar. If you remembered it, great. If not, hope you have recollected it from your first year syllabus. Since both are absolutely non-polar substances, here also the attraction forces must be London forces. Coming to third one, sodium perchlorate. NaClO4 is sodium perchlorate because ClO4 minus 1 is perchlorate ion. Now it is very evident that sodium perchlorate is an ionic compound. Sodium cation Na plus 1, perchlorate anion ClO4 minus 1. An ionic compound dissolved into water. Just now I told you, it dissociates into ions. Sodium cation and perchlorate anion become independent. Then each sodium cation will be surrounded by a set of water molecules. Each perchlorate anion will be surrounded by a set of water molecules. When water molecules surround sodium cation, they would surround through their negative ends. When they surround perchlorate anion, they would surround through their positive ends. Such interactions are called ion dipole forces. So, the attraction forces that will be holding sodium perchlorate in water will be ion dipole forces. Then comes methanol and acetone. This is methanol. This is acetone. Please observe, oxygen and hydrogen bond will be polar, no doubt, and carbon and oxygen bond will be polar, no doubt. Now you see, between acetone and acetone there cannot be intermolecular hydrogen bonding. Why? In acetone, hydrogens are not attached to oxygens, hydrogens are attached to carbons. Carbon-hydrogen bond cannot involve in hydrogen bonding. So, no doubt one acetone and other acetone can be held only by dipole-dipole forces. Whereas in methanol, oxygen is attached to hydrogen, that's why electropositive hydrogen of one methanol and electronegative oxygen of other methanol will be attracted by intermolecular hydrogen bonds. Now when methanol is mixed with acetone, there is an electronegative oxygen of acetone at close vicinity to the electropositive hydrogen of methanol. That's why when they are mixed with each other, they may enter into intermolecular hydrogen bonding. Very good, very classic examples these are. Please remember them. It will be helping you in further understanding of this chapter. Okay. So, because methanol has an electropositive hydrogen in the near vicinity to electronegative oxygen of acetone, they can enter into intermolecular hydrogen bonding with each other. But the intermolecular hydrogen bonding may not be as strong as it was between the methanol molecules. Before mixing, methanol molecules might have had intermolecular hydrogen bonding. Now after mixing, these two will enter into intermolecular hydrogen bonding. Coming to this, acetone nitrile. This is the nitrile group of organic chemistry, C triple bond N. Acetone nitrile is the one coming from acetic acid, produced from acetic acid. So 2 carbons it must have. Then acetone, just now I wrote. Now you see carbon electropositive, nitrogen electronegative. Here also carbon electropositive, oxygen electronegative. So between the positive carbon end of acetone and negative nitrogen end of acetonitrile, positive end of carbon of acetonitrile and negative oxygen end of acetone, there could be attraction. These are nothing but dipole-dipole forces. So between the molecules of acetonitrile and acetone, there will be dipole-dipole forces. This is question number 3 of your review exercise 2.2 related to identifying interparticle forces between substances. It would be great if you could pick up few random examples yourself and try to identify interparticle forces in them, because this concept is very, very important. You know very well, review exercise is aimed at brushing up our fundamental knowledge that is required to understand the concepts of present chapter easily. To understand the concept of solubility further, in many aspects where we are accounting for factors affecting solubility, we have to apply Le-Chatelier principle to make conclusions. That's why in this review exercise, in the first question of this review exercise, 2 questions are given based on Le-Chatelier principle. Before answering them, let me remind you Le-Chatelier principle. I will not be teaching in detail. You will have to go back and revise yourself. But let me remind you the Le Chatelier principle. See, when a process A in equilibrium with B reaches equilibrium, the concentrations would have remained constant, means process is progressing, process is dynamic, but progress is static. Concentration will not increase or decrease, temperature will not increase or decrease, pressure will not increase or decrease. So once a process, a reversible process reaches equilibrium, concentrations of both reactants and products, temperature, pressure, everything continues to be the same, constant with time. Now it is just remaining constant such that I am not finding any progress, so I am bored, so I am doing some change outside. I am increasing or decreasing concentration, I am increasing or decreasing temperature, I am increasing or decreasing pressure. Then what happens? Until the change you have done from outside is nullified, until the change you have done from outside is nullified, the equilibrium will go in that direction which will nullify the change. Means you increase the concentration of A, equilibrium would like to decrease the concentration of A. When will the concentration of A be decreased? When the forward process happens. That's why it continues in forward process. You decreased the concentration of A, then equilibrium would like to increase the concentration of A, then it will go in backward process where A is formed. Same way, you try to increase temperature, it will go in a direction where temperature is decreased. We will get from these examples. You try to increase pressure, it will go in a direction in which pressure will be decreased. You will get from these examples. So whatever the change I do externally, whatever the constraint I bring externally, the equilibrium will readjust itself and proceed in a direction which will nullify the constraint I have made from outside. With that knowledge, let us try and answer this question. Okay. See here, he has given an association reaction where, or a combination reaction I can simply call it, where two gaseous elements A and B are combining to form a gaseous compound AB, and the process appeared to be exothermic. Please observe that. Now two questions are asked. One is, if you maintain a high temperature, which process will be predominant, association or dissociation? That is the question. Here forward is association, backward is dissociation, and the forward process is exothermic, which means the backward process would be absolutely endothermic. Now, because the forward is exothermic, backward is endothermic, and remember, in exothermic direction temperature increases, in endothermic direction temperature decreases. Now, whenever we are accounting for Le Chatelier principle, we think in two dimensions. Number one, what's happening in the system? Number two, what have I done externally? So please understand. Forward association is an exothermic process, he is saying. And just now I told you, within the system, internally, temperature is increasing in the forward direction. Similarly, dissociation would be an endothermic process. So internally in the system, in backward direction, temperature is decreasing. That is what is happening internally. So internally, forward process, in forward process, temperature is increasing. In backward process, temperature is decreasing. Now, externally, what if I do something? What happens there? Opposite. So he is saying externally I am increasing the temperature, means I am maintaining high temperature. Now, when I increase the temperature, the system would like to shift to a direction where there is decrease in temperature. In which direction there is decrease in temperature? Endothermic direction. Which process here is endothermic? Backward process. Which is that? Dissociation. So, when it comes to temperature, what you need to keep in mind is, in exothermic direction temperature increases, in endothermic direction temperature decreases. If you remember that, then based on what change we do from outside, the opposite change will be done inside. Clear? Now coming to, what is the pressure required for association to be predominant? Now when we are thinking of temperature, I said you think whether it is exothermic or endothermic. When you are worrying about pressure, you worry about number of moles of gases. Pressure is directly proportional to number of moles of gases. So in whichever the direction number of moles of gases is increasing, pressure is increasing. In whichever the direction number of moles of gases is decreasing, pressure is decreasing. Here, 2 moles of gas is becoming 1 mole. So in this case, in forward direction, pressure is decreasing because number of moles of gas is decreasing. In backward direction, pressure is decreasing because number of moles of gases is decreasing. Number of moles of gas is increasing. That's why in backward direction pressure is increasing. So that is internal. Forward pressure is decreasing, backward pressure is increasing. Now he wants the forward process to be predominant. Means he wants the equilibrium to shift in a direction where pressure should decrease. Means from outside I should increase pressure. When I increase pressure from outside, equilibrium will shift in a direction where the pressure will decrease. Where is it decreasing? Forward. So if you want the forward process, you need to maintain high pressure. If you want the forward process to be predominant, you need to maintain high pressure because in the forward process, the pressure is being lowered. So if you maintain high pressure externally, equilibrium will shift in a direction where the pressure is lowered. Recollecting the Le-Chatelier principle now comfortably. Let us quickly recollect again using this equilibrium. Question number 2. A solid AB becoming aqueous cation and anion. Forward process is dissolution, backward process is precipitation. Then what kind of salt is solid AB? We revised it in electrochemistry chapter also. You are absolutely right. It is a sparingly soluble salt. So a sparingly soluble salt dissolving and forming ions, and ions are combining and precipitating as a sparingly soluble salt, and dissolution is exothermic, precipitation is endothermic for AB salt. Whereas for a salt CD, dissolution is endothermic, precipitation is exothermic. Now he is asking, if you increase temperature, what happens to the extent of dissolution? Now, in first case, with dissolution, temperature is increasing. With precipitation, the temperature is decreasing because forward is exothermic, backward is endothermic. In case of this one, CD, with dissolution, temperature is decreasing. With precipitation, temperature is increasing. That is what is internally happening. Now, what is he saying? Externally, I am increasing temperature. When I increase temperature, here it would like to go in a direction where there is a decrease in temperature. It is the backward process in which there is decrease in temperature. So, in case of AB, with increase in temperature, precipitation occurs. That means the extent of dissolution decreases. Whereas here, if you increase the temperature, it would like to go in a direction where there is decrease in temperature. Where is decrease in temperature here? Forward, dissolution. So, with increase in temperature in case of CD, dissolution increases. So, for AB, extent of dissolution decreases with temperature, increase in temperature. For CD, extent of dissolution increases with increase in temperature because the forward process dissolution is opposite in case of the system at equilibrium. Is that clear? With these two examples, hope the concept of Le-Chatelier principle is recollected by you. Whatever I am going to teach in the next 2 sessions or 3 sessions I can say, whatever I am going to teach you in the next 3 sessions, all these 3 concepts are very important. Constituent particles of a given matter, what attraction forces hold them. Number 3, Le-Chatelier principle. If you are not thorough with these 3 concepts, the next 3 sessions will not be understood better. That is why this is being revised. I know I have revised your school as well as first PU fundamentals. If you knew all of them strongly, well and good, you have not needed this session. But I had to do my job, so I did the quick revision. Now, let us wind up this session by defining the solubility and doing one of the learning exercises. Okay? Let's define solubility. See, the quantity of solute that gets dissolved in a given quantity of solvent at a given temperature to make a saturated solution. See, the term saturation and the term solubility are interconnected. I can't define solubility without using saturation. I can't define saturated solution without using the word solubility. Now, understand the three key words in this definition: the solute quantity, the solvent quantity, the temperature to make a saturated solution. So, what is a saturated solution? Enough amount. Means can't dissolve more than this. When your stomach is full, you say I am saturated. Well, when you have worked a lot during a job, you say I am saturated today, I can't work anymore. Likewise, when there is enough quantity, you call the solution saturated. Means I can't take any more. That level is called saturation. To reach that level in a given quantity of solvent at a given temperature, what quantity of solute is required is called its solubility. So solubility is nothing but quantity of solute. But what should be predefined? The amount of solvent and the temperature at which we are dissolving must be predefined. Clear? If you are clear with this definition, solubility can be expressed in more than one ways. That is, number of grams of solute per 100 grams of solvent, means at a given temperature, how many grams of solute can be dissolved in every 100 grams of solvent. Say for example, sodium chloride at 20 degrees Celsius exhibits a solubility of 36 grams. Now comes the question. Temperature 20 degrees Celsius and solubility is 36 grams of sodium chloride is said. In what quantity of water? In 100 grams of water. Means at 20 degrees Celsius, in every 100 grams of water, you can't dissolve more than 36 grams of sodium chloride. So, in terms of number of grams per every 100 grams of solvent, it can be expressed, or sometimes it will be expressed as grams per liter. That is, number of grams of solute that can be dissolved in 1 liter of solvent to make a saturated solution. Or, I have already told you when I was teaching applications of Kohlrausch law that solubility can be expressed as molarity also. That is, number of moles of solute that can be dissolved in 1 liter of solution. So, moles per liter. Or, lastly, it can be expressed as mole fraction also. You know very well, number of moles of solute in total number of moles of solution is called mole fraction. So, what is the mole fraction of solute in a given solution also expresses its solubility. Means, if mole fraction of that solute reaches so much, it will become a saturated solution. Means it cannot dissolve more than that fraction of solute. So, likewise, it can be expressed as any of these ways. That is definition of solubility and how it is expressed. Now, based on solubility, solutions are of 3 types. One is unsaturated solution. The second one is saturated solution. The third one is supersaturated solutions. Hope you have heard of them in your school. However, let me present in my own way based on the increased standards of PUC. See here, the dissolution process can be expressed like this. Solute plus solvent giving rise to solution. Now, some of the solute from solution may come back and precipitate, and it might divide into solute and solvent. So forward process in this possibly reversible process, the forward process is dissolution. The backward process can be called as precipitation or otherwise crystallization. The forward process is called dissolution, backward process is called precipitation or crystallization. Now comes the question, what is unsaturated solution? I just now told you, saturation and solubility are interlinked, both cannot be defined without each other. Now, to define an unsaturated solution, I should use the word solubility. A solution in which the amount of solute in dissolved state is less than its solubility is called unsaturated solution. That means, for example, come here. At 20 degrees Celsius, in 100 grams of water, 36 grams of sodium chloride can be soluble. But say I have dissolved only 30 grams or 25 grams or 26 grams or 12 grams or 15 grams, anything less than 36 grams. Then I have prepared an unsaturated solution of sodium chloride at 20 degrees Celsius. Now comes the question, which process is dominant in an unsaturated solution? The forward process will be dominant, means the rate of dissolution will be greater than the rate of crystallization. I repeat, rate of dissolution would be greater than the rate of crystallization, such that you keep adding the salt, it will keep dissolving. Some of it must be precipitating, but the amount dissolving is more than the amount precipitating. That's why you will not be seeing anything precipitating. Got it? So forward process will be dominant. Now coming to saturated solution. A solution in which the amount of solute in dissolved state is exactly equal to its solubility at a given temperature. A solution in which the amount of substance in dissolved state is exactly equal to its solubility at a given temperature. Again, coming back to this example. I have dissolved at 20 degrees Celsius in 100 grams of water. I have dissolved exactly 36 grams of sodium chloride. It cannot take any more. Then you call it a saturated solution. Now, in saturated solution, what is the condition of this equilibrium? In saturated solution, you know very well, so the process is exactly in equilibrium. That means rate of dissolution is exactly equal to rate of crystallization. What does it mean? Exact amount required to become saturated is being added. If you add some more quantity, dissolution will occur and the same amount of solute will crystallize. Please understand, rate of dissolution is equal to rate of crystallization, means the process is exactly has reached equilibrium. So once you prepare a saturated solution, this reversible process reaches equilibrium. That means rate of dissolution is equal to rate of crystallization. That means you add 1 extra gram. Here I have dissolved exactly 36 grams. There is equilibrium reached. I add 1 extra gram. This 1 gram will dissolve and the dissolved 1 gram will crystallize. Now you may ask me, for a person seeing a vessel full of sodium chloride solution, I am adding 1 gram. I feel that 1 gram is unable to dissolve, that's why it came and settled down. How are you sure that 1 gram has precipitated, a forward process has happened? With the same rate, the 1 gram from dissolved has crystallized. The answer is simple. The evidence for this dynamic equilibrium in a saturated solution comes from radioactive techniques. That means, suppose I want to test this with sugar. After preparing a saturated solution with a non-radioactive sugar, I will add some quantity of radioactive sugar. Now, if the possibility that dissolved solute only is just settling down, dissolution and precipitation both are not happening, if that is true, then the settled sugar must be radioactive and solution should remain non-radioactive. Whereas if this dynamic equilibrium is achieved, then the added radioactive sugar should dissolve, then solution will become radioactive, and same amount of dissolved non-radioactive sugar should precipitate. Same amount of dissolved non-radioactive sugar should precipitate. Now solution should turn radioactive, and during these radioactive experiments, radioactive labeling experiments, they have noticed that solution turned radioactive and precipitated sugar was non-radioactive, which proves that there is this dynamic equilibrium in saturated solution. Now comes the supersaturated solution, a solution in which more quantity of solute than its solubility is in its dissolved state at a given temperature. Less quantity of solute than its solubility at a given temperature is dissolved. Same quantity of solute than its solubility at a given temperature is dissolved. Now in supersaturated solution, more amount of solute than its solubility is in its dissolved state, then you call it supersaturated solution. Now in supersaturated solution, what happens? Rate of dissolution will be less than the rate of crystallization, or rate of crystallization will be more because it is already dissolving more. That's why what happens with a simple disturbance, like simple stirring or simple mechanical disturbance, will crystallize and solution will come back to equilibrium and become saturated solution. Like imagine you went to some relative's house and you ate what you could, say some 4 chapatis your capacity, and you ate it. But relatives forced you, and out of hesitation you could not stop, so they went on feeding you the curd rice, the dessert, the sweets, etc. You are too saturated, you are super saturated now. Assume your cousin comes and punches you in the stomach saying, "Hi dude, how are you?" What happens to you? You are already super saturated, so whatever the excess will. Similarly, with a simple mechanical disturbance, a supersaturated solution will be precipitated and becomes a saturated solution. This is the definition of solubility, units of solubility, and classification of solutions based on solubility. Now, we have a simple learning exercise, a small exercise containing 3 questions based on this solubility concept. Let us answer them. Okay. See, in the first question of learning exercise 2.3, at a given temperature, 30 degrees Celsius, solubility of a given salt was found to be 50. Whether they mention without units or say grams, they are meaning number of grams per 100 grams. I have already told you many ways they express, right? So when they don't give any units or give grams as the units, they are meaning number of grams per 100 grams of solvent. So he is asking, what is the weight of water needed to make a saturated solution if solubility is 50 grams? Okay. So he wants to dissolve 90 grams of the solute and solubility of the solute is 50 grams at this temperature. Now he wants the weight of water needed to dissolve 90 grams of the solute. Now it's very simple from the definition of solubility. 50 grams can be dissolved in how many grams? 100 grams. So we need to find 90 grams can be dissolved in how much? So 50 grams of solute dissolves in 100 gram water. Therefore, 90 grams of solute in 100 by 50 into 90. So 50 will divide this on 2 times. So you need 180 grams of water to dissolve 90 grams of solute. This question is just to make you understand the fundamental definition of solubility. That is, number of grams of solute that can be completely dissolved to make a saturated solution in 100 grams of solvent. Second question also is on the similar grounds. Solubility is 40 and you are supplied with 50 grams of water, not 100 grams of water. Then what is the weight of solute that can be really dissolved? Again, can be done just like that. Solubility 40 indicates that 100 grams of water can dissolve 40 grams. So 50 grams will be able to dissolve 20 grams. So as per the definition of solubility, 100 gram water dissolves 50 gram solute, therefore 50 gram water can dissolve. Solubility 40 they said, right? Sorry. Solubility is 40. So 100 grams of water can dissolve 40 grams of solute. Therefore 50 grams of water can dissolve 20 grams of solute. That is question number 2 of learning exercise 2.3. Now look at the third question. Solubility product of cupric sulfide is given. You know cupric sulfide is a sparingly soluble salt. And maximum molarity of cupric sulfide in the solution is asked. See, what does maximum molarity mean? If solubility is expressed as molarity, then maximum molarity in solution of that sparingly soluble salt is nothing but its solubility, because how much ever is dissolved, so much concentration only it can exhibit, right? So maximum molarity, by asking maximum molarity, indirectly he is asking you solubility. Now, before trying to answer this question, I'll try to give you quick recap from your ionic equilibrium chapter. See, if a sparingly soluble salt is of AB type, like this copper sulfide, RAgCl, silver chloride, silver iodide, barium sulfate, all these things, one cation and one anion, right? That's why AB type. AB type solid dissolves in water to form, say, AN plus, I don't know how many units of charge is there. So AN plus aqueous plus Bn minus aqueous. Because charges will be equal only, you will have 1:1 ratio of ions, right? Now, if solubility is equal to S molar, then as per this balanced equation, 1 mole of salt forms 1 mole each of cation and anion, right? Therefore, S moles which is dissolved, S moles is dissolved, that's why solubility is S moles. 1 mole of it would have formed 1 mole each, so S moles of it would have formed S moles each of this. Now I have already explained you the expression for solubility product. Solubility product is expressed as product of concentrations of ions in the dissolution equation raised to the power of their coefficients. Here coefficients of 1 each only, so solubility is AN plus concentration into Bn minus concentration. Now what is the concentration of AN plus? S moles. What is the concentration of Bn minus? S moles. S into S is S square. So for a AB type salt, Ksp is equal to S square, therefore S is equal to square root of Ksp. Got my point? Say there is AB2 type salt, say ferrous hydroxide, which is also a precipitate, okay, or any other salt, say Ag2S, silver sulfide, which is also A2B or AB2, whatever the type. If this is the kind of salt it is, then solid AB2 salt dissociates as A plus aqueous, I can say A2 plus aqueous plus B minus aqueous, 2 moles of B minus aqueous, right? So each mole of salt gives 1 mole of cation, 2 moles of anions. Now if solubility is S and S moles have dissolved, how much ever is dissolved, so much only forms ions, right? So if S moles of AB2 is dissolved, then S moles of A2 plus and 2 S moles of B minus will be formed. Now Ksp expression will be concentration of A2 plus into concentration of B minus square, right? Concentration of A2 plus is S into concentration of B minus is 2S square, right? That's equal to S into 4S square, that is 4S cube. So for AB2 type salt, Ksp is 4S cube, so S will be Ksp by 4 to the power 1 by 3, that is cube root of Ksp by 4. This is how, when solubility product is given, solubility is calculated, solubility is given, solubility product is calculated for sparingly soluble salts. So please remember, the relation between solubility product and solubility of sparingly soluble salt depends on the formula of the salt. If it is AB type, Ksp is equal to S square. If it is AB2 type, Ksp is equal to 4S cube. Likewise, if it is AB3 type, same grounds you can derive. We are assuming solubility as S molar. So 1 mole of salt gives how many moles each of cation and anion, you check. And S moles would give how many moles, you check. Then this will be the concentration of ions. Substitute the concentration of ions in the KSP expression and get the relation. Accordingly, cupric sulfide is AB type salt. So you understood that KSP is equal to S square for copper sulfide. Therefore, solubility is equal to square root of KSP.